Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for Miami Presents Happy Holidays or Bah Humbug, a supply chain update. My name is JJ Slager, and I'm a Director of Alumni Relations at Miami University. I'm very excited today to be joined by two esteemed Miami professors who are going to share their expertise on this timely issue around the supply chain. Lisa and Monique, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you. And I'd like to thank, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, please, go.
I was going to say, I'd like to thank everybody out there for joining us at this busy holiday time. So as JJ said, my name is Lisa Ellram, and I'm a University Distinguished Professor and the Reese Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management. It's my 14th year here at Miami, and I do research into sustainable supply chains, supply chain relationships, and cost issues. And all of these things have become increasingly relevant with what we're experiencing globally. So I'm happy to be here with you today, and I'll turn it over to Monique to introduce herself.
Thank you, Lisa and JJ. Good morning, everyone, or I guess almost afternoon here. I'm Monique Murfield, also in the Farmer School of Business in our Supply Chain and Operations Management program. I'm an associate professor in my 7th year here, and I teach in our Intro to Supply Chain and Operations program as well as our logistics class. I serve as the director of our Center for Supply Chain Excellence, which is new within the last year and was created to kind of serve as a hub for everything that we do in integrating industry partners and alumni into our classes with our students and faculty. And I do research also in supply chain sustainability, buyer-supplier relationships, and challenges with omni-channel retailing. So, all of the supply chain issues behind you being able to buy online and pick up in store in an hour. So excited to talk about some of these topics with you today. Before we get started, JJ, is there some kind of process things that you want to go over for questions and that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. Thanks to all of the audience that submitted questions ahead of time. We did include some of those in what we plan to do already, and hopefully we'll cover a lot of that. If you want to participate live, we would love that. If you're watching live, you can ask a question by hitting the Ask a Question button right below the video, and we will try to get to those when they come up, if they're timely, or at the end we'll have some time for Q&A as well. So please participate as we go along, and thank you once again both for your introductions as well, making it easy on me. I'll get it started with a basic question. I think obviously supply chain professionals here, but let's start with the basics. What is a supply chain, and why is it so important to companies?
Yeah, thank you, JJ. We wanted to start with the basics because we have a variety of people on the webinar with us, which is exciting. If you're not a supply chain professional and you've just recently been hearing about all the supply chain issues on the news, what is a supply chain? A supply chain is everything that a company manages, from sourcing its raw materials and components that go into its product all the way through manufacturing, through distribution to the customer, and also reverse flows. So it includes that whole path for products as well as services. So procurement, logistics, sustainability aspects throughout, working with customers on the downstream end as well as upstream with suppliers. So it's a lot of things, and we're going to touch on lots of different challenges that are going on with supply chains today. It impacts every business. Every business has a supply chain, whether they're product focused or service focused or a mix of the two. And many consumers are now seeing how supply chains impact them, like you and I. So we'll talk about that today as well.
Awesome. Oops, wrong one there. All right, so thanks for that introduction. Let's start with some of the challenges. What are the challenges that companies are facing, and what is the past and ongoing connection to the pandemic?
Great. Well, that is a big question. So one of the reasons that things are so tough right now is because we started this whole process with the pandemic. So very early when the pandemic first hit, there was just kind of coming together of a lot of very powerful forces working against supply chains. First, a little history. Of course, you all know the fact that we are so global makes this so much more impactful. If this was 20 or 30 years ago, we would be dealing much, much more with local supply chains where we might have disruptions of supply, but the magnitude of the impact of the disruption of transportation wouldn't be nearly as great as it is now. So right when this was first beginning, it was during the time in late January where it was the Chinese New Year. And the Chinese New Year, the factory shut down for 2-3 weeks or more because the pandemic was just beginning and China was really trying to limit its spread. They actually closed the factories for even longer. So we were already a few weeks behind in terms of production because of the normal shutdown that we have. And then we became even farther behind because the factories remained closed for a couple more weeks at least after that, and some of them even longer, and some of them, started up with limited capacity. So that really put kind of a bottleneck and really slowed down the supply coming in. So as that was happening, we were trying to see the rest of the world, is this going to come and hit us or not? So it didn't hit us right away. So we were, continuing to consume. And then about, early mid-March, when it was really clear that it was coming here, we started to shut things down. And we shut down our own factories. We shut down our own distribution. And a lot of companies were completely closed and couldn't make anything, couldn't ship anything unless you were an essential supplier. Some of you might have already forgotten that. It was about 2 years ago now. So here we are now. We're very, very far behind in the amount of supply that we have available. We're behind in shipping things. The transportation is slowed down. The docks are slowed down. And then we're sitting around at home saying, this is going to be a while. Well, we better start ordering things. So at first, we weren't ordering anything. So even the companies that could still produce, they were slowing their production down. And then all of a sudden, we started ordering all sorts of crazy things that you couldn't anticipate, as well as, eating more food at home instead of going out. So all of these things really set us behind in terms of inventory and in terms of transportation slowdowns, on top of which, as I mentioned, we were consuming some different things than we used to. So companies were trying to get up to speed. And then, as you all recall, there were some hoarding issues that also set us back. So we had, everybody buying every mask they could get their hand on, the great toilet paper crisis of 2020, the hand sanitizer. So all of those things put us way behind. And then very, very importantly, the workforce. So people were getting sick. People had to stay home because their kids couldn't find daycare. They had to stay home because their company was closed down. So we just didn't have the capacity. So all these things came together and set us up for this perfect storm at the beginning of the pandemic that we just haven't been able to sort of dig our way out of. So I'm going to turn it over to Monique to talk a little bit more about sort of where we are now.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So like Lisa talked about, where we are now stems from really an imbalance in supply and demand, and imbalance in the capacity that we have and the demand that we're trying to fill in lots of different areas. It's really hit every company in some way or another. So currently, many companies are experiencing issues with infrastructure across the United States. Initially, maybe they're importing goods from overseas and they're having issues getting ships into the ports, not just on the West Coast, although that is a big bottleneck, as we call it, or a big area that's holding things up, but really all of the ports around the United States, because things are being moved around. And that's just one piece of the equation. Once those goods get into the port, then what happens? They have to get on a truck. Well, we don't have as many trucks and drivers as we need. So that becomes another issue. They have to get unloaded and put on a rail car. So the capacity at all these points in the supply chain, each of them are kind of dominoes and they're all piling up, right? So addressing one piece, for example, 24-hour operation at the port is not going to magically solve our issues overnight. And beyond the infrastructure issues, Lisa touched on workforce challenges. And although that has been happening throughout the pandemic, it's still an issue. As most people are aware of, many companies are having issues attracting and retaining their workforce. And this goes to top supply chain talent all the way to the people on the floor in a manufacturing facility or in the distribution center. And all of those people are essential to keep these supply chains moving. So that also adds to companies' capacity issues in keeping up with the demand and moving goods throughout their supply chain because they don't always have enough people where they're needed to do each of those pieces. Now, once those products actually get here and get moved through the US supply chain, it could be, several months after they planned on them getting here. So is that inventory even going to matter at that point? Then we may have an issue of inventory obsolescence, whether it's goods that are spoiled or goods that are just no longer relevant. Maybe they were for Christmas sales and they didn't make it. And so now companies have lots and lots of inventory, right? So as we've talked with different companies, those are some of the things that they are noting that are major challenges right now and that they're seeing, initially not enough inventory and then, oh, now we're going to have piles of inventory once all this gets through the system. So those are the big challenges that companies are dealing with right now and kind of the connection of all the dominoes, if you will, and all the pressure points within the system. JJ, if we want to switch to the next question, I think it kind of connects to this.
Yeah. So you talk about the big challenges, but it seems like there's also the risk of overreacting. So what is the biggest challenge for manufacturers to consider so they don't overreact to supply chain concerns?
So that is a really good question. Again, and thank you, because I know that one of my former students, a Miami alum, asked that question. Hi, Kevin. I hope you're out there. So I think the market signals are so confusing and deceiving right now. We're not used to seeing these type of market signals. So many of you, if you have graduated from college recently, or if you've been reading articles about this, some of these ideas recently, you might be familiar with the idea of the bullwhip effect. So what the bullwhip effect is that when you see a change in what's happening in the market, so for example, if you see demand go up, you order way less. Or if you see demand go down, if demand goes up, you order way more. And if demand goes down, you order way less. So it's sort of this overreaction. And then if you're the one closest to the consumer, like the grocery store, you pass that signal onto the distributor. They overreact. You pass that signal on to the manufacturer. They overreact, and down the supply chain, up and down the supply chain. And what happens then is that you end up either overreacting so that you have way more inventory than you need, or you end up maybe not responding quickly enough. So what happens then is that as you're waiting for your supplies to get there, as people are now, they start to worry and they're like, I wonder if these supplies are actually going to get here at all. Maybe I better order again. Maybe next time I better order more because it seems like I'm not getting everything I order. So what happens then is you start getting these really confusing signals from the marketplace. They're not based on what people are really needing and consuming, but they're basing on sort of this fear that I just need to keep ordering and ordering and ordering until I get what I need. And that sounds crazy, but it's a proven phenomenon that happens again and again. So I think that's really important for companies to try to tease out what is really happening with demand Is it a long-term change or is it a short-term change? So we saw like with the lumber industry and the lumber mills, they had kind of a spike in demand and they were quite a bit behind. And they specifically indicated, we think that this is not a permanent change. So we're not going to build another lumber mill. It's going to take us 3 to 5 years to get a lumber mill online. And we think things will be calmed down. So that was the way that they read the market. Other companies, for example, some of the frozen food companies, they said, oh yeah, we think, people have been eating at home. They're going to like eating at home. They've gotten used to it. So we're actually going to add some physical capacity. Is that the right decision or not? So that whole idea of phantom demand, of people ordering things that they really don't need just so that they'll get something. And one area that's an example of that, or has been an example, I think, is major appliances. So what's happened with major appliances is some of them are very hard to get. Like if you go to Home Depot and you need a refrigerator, they might not have the one you want for, say, several months. So you'll order that one, but you can always cancel that order. So maybe you'll get online and you'll find another one. Well, this one's pretty good. I don't like it quite as much, but I do need to get one. So I'm going to order this one and then I'll keep whichever one comes first. Or maybe you'll do that with 4 items. Well, now, the marketplace is picking up on this and saying, wow, look at all this demand for refrigerators when you really only need 1, not 4, and you're going to cancel the other 3. And I think that kind of goes back to what Monique was indicating that we see happening with all the items that have been ordered for Christmas, not to jump the gun, but there's so much stuff. I want to know what's in all those containers sitting outside of the ports. What is in all those containers? How much of that is for real demand and how much of that is for phantom demand? And of course, you're in a lot more trouble if you're in a seasonal industry, if you've ordered based on phantom demand versus, if you're an automotive manufacturer, yeah, it's going to be expensive to carry that inventory, but you can probably use it. So this is, I think, what the manufacturers as well as the retailers, everybody who's placing orders, they really have to be paying close attention and trying to pick up on the market signals the best that they can in terms of what's real, what's short-term, and what's long-term.
All right, thank you very much. I'm going to add in a live question. Thanks to Beth from the audience, and she says, it seems that a huge bottleneck is getting parts or products to the U.S. and then distributed. So isn't this a major part of all the issues? You kind of alluded to that, but talk about the actual bottleneck of the ports and the distribution a little more, please.
Yeah, so I think Monique talked a little bit about that before, and she can also jump in at any time. But so what's happening is, as most of you probably know, if you've been reading the news or watching the news at all, there are just a tremendous number of ships that are waiting to get into the U.S. and to be unloaded. And there have been, probably at least 10 days this fall when we've broken the previous record for the most number of ships that are waiting and the most number of ships that are in the berth. And part of that is, this is always a busy time of year, probably a little earlier than this for the holidays, but then there's the feeling that people kind of over-ordered also. They ordered a little earlier because there was so much talk about how bad it was going to be. So perhaps, we created some of this, the anticipation, almost like the bullwhip effect, that we've created some of this. The problem now, and some reporters, and they've talked to like the truck drivers and the people who are really on the ground at the ports, and they're reporting the ports are so congested. So there's so many stacks of containers stacked up, and there's so many lines to unload that where you used to be able to go back and forth to the port maybe 4 to 6 times in a day, you might get in twice in a day. So it's this huge bottleneck that it needs to be sort of untangled. We need to get more stuff out of there. Somehow we need to get more stuff out of there. And one of the problems with the port is, and the head of the Port Authority of Los Angeles has brought this up numerous times, there are a number of independent companies that operate the port, and they all have sort of their own processes. And everybody sort of has the way that they like to pick up goods and the times that they like to pick up goods, and they don't necessarily want to change that. So even though the port now, some organizations that are at the port, they've opened for more hours and more days, there really isn't anybody coming to pick things up at those times because those aren't normal working hours. And there's just, there's enough stress on the people who work in those jobs already that I think to try to get them to work different hours and start picking things up at night, you might start having more turnover that could actually create more problems. So yeah, the port it's definitely a big bottleneck, as are the other transportation modes. So Monique, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, I tried to touch on that a bit before, but related to this question, even if it's not the port that's the source, if a company is not importing something, there's issues across the domestic supply chain that are impacting everybody. Whether that's we've talked to multiple companies and read articles about warehouse space is at an all-time high usage or low of open capacity, right? Because these companies are holding much more inventory. Talked with a company the other day that said, the percentage of additional warehouse space that they're paying for outside of their own is at an all-time high because, like Lisa talked about, they've panicked. Basically, they're ordering and getting whatever they can and holding it. So that's one piece. The other is there's only so many truck drivers and trucks to haul this stuff. Capacity for all of these pieces can't change overnight. And we're going to talk about some of those issues and addressing those issues a little bit later. So there's different aspects, different bottlenecks beyond the ports that are impacting all of the companies. And it could be as, somebody thinks it's as simple, quote, simple as, the workforce in a distribution center, but that's a major piece of the equation too, right? The workforce issue that I mentioned, and not having enough people to do everything. So all of these things are just adding up. So companies that are global, which is most companies, and are dealing with imports, have that and the port congestion added on top of those domestic issues that all companies are experiencing for domestic movement as well.
All right, thanks for sharing. So this next question is going to take some prognostication on your part, but how long will it take to solve the supply chain problem in the U.S.?
Sure, I can take this. Lisa and I had some discussion about this ahead of time. We see all kinds of articles, and this is like the question of the year: when will all these problems go away? We're going to say not before summer of 2022. So, some of the problems that we've talked about, like the imbalance in supply and demand, for example, and digging out of some of these issues with the ports and the infrastructure and capacity challenges in different areas, they take time to even out. So right now, as Lisa said, or a little bit before now, in the fall is typically peak season for going into the holidays for consumer goods. And so we should see that demand drop off, which could be a reprieve for companies. Additionally, companies that import from China, China shuts down typically in February for several weeks for the Chinese New Year. So those factories will not be running. Typically, companies plan ahead that are ordering, before that time, but they know that they'll have a period of shutdowns during that time. So those two pieces could help even out the equation that we've been talking about and kind of help balance the supply and demand issues. But it's not going to be overnight. And some of these issues are much longer term. So we'll talk about, some longer term ways to address those and what companies are doing here in a bit as well.
Yeah. And we have the lingering, workforce issues. And globally, we have this whole issue of kind of where is the virus hitting? It's, it's still out there. And we depend a lot on other companies, or I'm sorry, on other countries for our goods. And we've seen, like with this most recent variant, people were really concerned about what's going to happen with Vietnam. We get a lot of clothes and shoes from Vietnam, but it doesn't seem to be hitting hard there. So we're very dependent, not just on what we can do and what happens in the US, but because of the way our supply chain is configured as a global network, we're really dependent on what happens elsewhere in the world as well. And it is interesting, we don't, in some ways, we don't seem to learn our lessons well from past disasters. So you think about when the Fukushima earthquake hit in Japan, the auto industry was so massively dependent on Japan for their chips, for red paint. There were all sorts of strange things that seemed to be only produced in Japan. You might have 2 factories or 3 suppliers there, but it was still only in this one region in Japan. So we're not quite as concentrated now, but we still, like certain regions of the world, we depend on so much for certain things that if something goes wrong, again, in this case, like with Vietnam, they were producing a lot of the furniture. So the furniture got really backed up, and we haven't been able to get out of that more towards the beginning of the pandemic. And now, we've seen the issues with potential disruption in shoes, athletic shoes, different types of shoes and clothing. So we really have to keep our eye on what's happening elsewhere in the world. And that prediction is assuming that things are not going to get really bad in other places in the world. Qualification. Don't put any money on that. At least if you do, don't blame us if you lose it.
That seems fair. That's also a good segue. You talk about our reliance on other countries. What about their supply chain issues? How do the supply chain issues in the U.S. compare to other countries' supply chain issues of their own?
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I can start this. Well, as Lisa said, most supply chains today are global, whether that is that goods and components and materials are sourced and manufactured globally, or they're sent to customers globally, or most times both. So it's very hard to disentangle that global network. We call it a supply chain, but it's really more of a very tangled, messy web. And when something happens in one area of the world, it affects many companies in other areas of the world, and kind of a domino effect, as we mentioned before. So most developed countries that deal in any significant amount of trade are experiencing similar issues. I read an article yesterday that was really interesting, following a toy supply chain, and it talked about coming and bringing a toy in from China to the UK. And, that in the UK, dealing with driver shortages and a shortage in warehouse storage space, similar to we've talked about here in the US. And so it's not just a United States or domestic issue, but it kind of compounds that they're having these issues in other parts of the world too, for companies whose supply chains are global. And so they're experiencing supply chain issues in different places that kind of compound on each other.
So related to that, I read in the UK, they were actually advertising. I'm not sure why. I'm sure there was some reason, but they were advertising in Poland they were trying to get truck drivers from Poland to come over to the UK and be a truck driver. And, you'd get paid very well, and it might, give you an opportunity to set up permanent residency in the UK. And I thought, apparently it didn't work well. Not too many people were taking them up on it, but that's kind of, that's kind of where we are. So it's not just us that are, desperately looking for employees in all areas, and especially in logistics sectors, but other countries are really experiencing the same thing.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Can you talk about whether the pressure points here that we've talked about so far, do they require public or private intervention, or some combination?
So I'll mention a little bit on the public intervention. So this has been very interesting that we've tried. There's a lot of things that we've tried to do, starting from the very beginning of the pandemic, kind of changing some of the requirements to say, okay, we really wish that we could all get those NIOSH or the special masks, but there's not enough material right now. So we're going to temporarily suspend some of the requirements. So this is one thing that we've seen happen that I would say that's more, public intervention. Sometimes you need to get something, something is better than nothing. So we have seen some public intervention in this regard. Like, I would say that at least some aspects of the current infrastructure bill are aimed at some of the supply chain bottlenecks. Looking at our road system, for example, China has literally invested billions and billions of dollars in their infrastructure, their logistics infrastructure, their roads, their ports. And the first meeting that Biden had with the president of China, he came back and he said, they are going to kick our butts if we don't do something to keep up. So we do have a real problem with our infrastructure related to supply chain and logistics in this country. So I think that is one of the areas of public intervention, that modernization that's based on that. Another thing that we've seen happening is, maybe some of you saw this, at the very end of November, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, launched a supply chain investigation. So that was very interesting. What they've done is they've contacted a handful of large companies, and they've asked them specifically to respond to the questions of, what are the pressure points and disruptions in your supply chain that are causing hardships for consumers, that are causing shortages, and you have 45 days to respond. The companies that they reached out to include, not surprisingly, Amazon. That would be number one on my list because they are so big and so powerful. Walmart, Kroger, Procter & Gamble, Tyson Foods, Kraft Heinz, and then some wholesale grocery companies like Associated Wholesale Grocers, McLane, and companies. So the FTC has, in my opinion, this is a little bit more about putting these people on notice, that, yeah, we do want to find out what the problems are, but if you're doing something that's non-competitive, that's hurting other people, that's hurting other supply chains, we want to make sure that that doesn't continue. So I think that's a very interesting approach. As far as I know, the FTC has really never taken a specific look at supply chains like this before. So we'll see what comes of it, but I'm watching it and I'm very interested.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. I wanted to expand on one aspect of that. You mentioned the infrastructure bill, and one of the things that we've discussed is an issue with enough truck drivers. So, where does that come from? Well, kids don't typically grow up and say, I think I'll grow up and be a long haul truck driver so that I can be gone for a week at a time, because of just lifestyle challenges, right? So many of the current truck drivers are of the age that they're retiring, and that combined with all of the increases in demand for e-commerce and things delivered directly to people's doors has created a big shortage in enough capacity in terms of truck drivers. And so part of that, and of course, that's not an overnight fix, right? So part of the infrastructure bill was a small part, right? There's lots of things in it, but a small part was focused on a pilot program was passed as part of the infrastructure bill, a pilot program to change the truck driver age from 21 to 18. So currently you can get a CDL if you're 18, but you can't drive across state lines. You have to be 21 for that. I mean, you can't move cargo that has moved across state lines, as far as my understanding. So that's a lot of cargo. So the pilot program was passed to not make a blanket change in the age of allowable truck drivers all at once, but to do a pilot for up to 3,000 apprentices or new truck drivers between the age of 18 and 20. And that'll be supervised for a significant number of hours by someone of an older age with, I think, 5 or more years of experience, and to see how that goes. And before they do a big blanket change to the driver age and those regulations. But that will be, is a small step in trying to address one of those issues. And so another example of public intervention. Lisa and I also talked about some elements of private intervention and what are companies really doing and what can they do. So we thought we'd just talk a little bit about some examples of what we've been hearing and talking with different companies. And some of this stems from the idea of the total cost of ownership, the total cost of getting a product to a company and in the customer's hands. That equation is changing. So what do I mean by that? We talk with our students about we can't just compare the price of supplier A and B that are in different countries and buy the one that's the cheapest, because there's a lot more that goes into the cost of getting that product throughout the supply chain. And not only those direct costs, but the risks. And the risk of disruption has become much more real for many companies. And so we've seen an increased focus on risk management and contingency planning. And so incorporating those ideas into companies' sourcing, companies are not necessarily not going to source globally because they often need to do so to be competitive, but they're starting to rethink the elements of their local or more regionalized sourcing in combination with global sources and what their supply network looks like. So that's one thing. Related to that, we're seeing a trend towards vertical integration, especially in the logistics sector. So major retailers or consumer goods manufacturers buying out logistics companies so that they can have control over that aspect of their supply chains. So those are a couple examples. Lisa, did you want to bring in a couple others there?
Sure. Yeah. And adding to that, so this idea of vertical integration, it's kind of a cyclical thing that you see happen in industries. Trucks and warehouses, they're expensive. They're very expensive. They show up on your balance sheet. If for any of you who invest, if you think about a company's return on assets, if you buy a bunch more assets like buildings, like equipment, you have to have a higher return to get that same percentage. So this is something that companies have been really trying to shed. A lot of companies, other than, of course, Amazon and Walmart, they both own a lot of that real estate. But we've even seen companies like American Eagle Outfitters. They just bought a couple logistics companies, and the CEO of the company was asked, like, why did you do this? And he said, this is how our customers get products, and we have to be close to the customer and we have to respond to the customer. So we're seeing this kind of simultaneous change going on in response to the pandemic of companies responding to the way that their customers are ordering more and more and more online, And how do we do that? Well, first we start by making it more available by selling more online. But the more and more we do that, we find we need to actually own those assets ourselves. So some of this, to me, it's when I started to see those early announcements, I was kind of surprised. I'm like, wow, do these guys know what they're doing? What are they get? So time will tell whether this is a good idea or not. So we'll be watching for that. Another area that's kind of strange in some ways that companies have been pursuing is they've been chartering their own ships. So instead of me getting on a public booking of a ship, putting my containers on there with 10,000 of my closest friends containers, I'm going to get my own ship. And a few reasons for doing this. So one has been they can get smaller ships, and those smaller ships can go into different ports. If you've got one of those gigantic container ships that can carry an equivalent of 24,000 TEUs, which is a 20-foot equivalent unit container, that's how big some of these are. They're carrying 16,000, 20,000, 24,000. There's only a handful of ports in the whole world that you can get in and out of, which obviously one of those is the port of Los Angeles, Long Beach, which is why it's so busy. So they charter their own ships. Sometimes they let a few of their friends put containers on them. And they've even been using ships that weren't designed as container ships, because as you can imagine, the demand for container ships is pretty full. And then they've been bypassing the system. So, of course, as you would expect, Amazon has been doing that. And so has Walmart. I think Target got involved. So this is really something that's exclusive to the bigger companies. And again, how everything is related in supply chain management. This kind of goes back to the FTC's concerns, like what are these bigger companies doing, and what assets and what competitive weapons do they have access to that these smaller companies can't, that are going to allow these big companies to just keep getting bigger and bigger and more powerful. So that's definitely one of them. Another thing that we see happening, which is again a little bit more definitely oriented towards big companies, is a lot more automation and technology. So they're really trying to balance the workforce that they have available to them so that they don't need as many people, and automating more and more things that are repetitive that you can use robots for. So, Amazon has just since 2019, and I truly don't even know how this is possible, Amazon has built 450 warehouses. So if you guys are complaining that you can't get building supplies, maybe we should look at Amazon. Are they using all of our building supplies? Seriously, I really don't know how that's possible. And these warehouses, they have robots in them. Most of them have, a pretty good sized human element as well, but they couldn't operate the warehouses that they have added without having robots. So we're seeing more of the robots for distribution. There's a big push, and if you watch the stock market, a lot of the tech companies that are dealing with automated, driverless vehicles, those are very hot right now because people see that as an alternative too. We need to have something for when the workforce is sick, or for when people, don't find the jobs that we have available to them attractive. And then there's also, if you're familiar with this, artificial intelligence, machine learning, which our students are learning that in classes right now. They can build these little algorithms to automate routine sort of sorting of paperwork. And I had a student who built a little algorithm for me where I collect a lot of information from the students about their who really contributed to them in class. And he built a little algorithm that could capture all that by student and create a little report, so that it took all that human work out of it. And that's what companies are doing. And it's really big. There's a lot of paperwork. There's a lot of exceptions. There's a lot of reporting in the logistics and accounting. And those areas are also being automated so that hopefully it's getting rid of the more mundane aspects of the work, but it definitely will be eliminating jobs. Not a problem right now, really, because we have more jobs available than people, but it's something that we really need to keep an eye on, is how is this going to have an effect on the future? So companies are definitely planning and thinking about what can we do so that next time something like this happens, we can manage it better, that we won't be taken so much by surprise.
Great. Thank you so much. So just for the audience, I only have one more question. So now's a great time if people still want to comment or ask anything of Lisa or Monique, throw those in the comments below your video. My last question is kind of summon things up. What will the impact be on consumers? And specifically, what does it mean for this holiday shopping rush right now, everything we've talked about?
Yeah, thanks, JJ. One thing we also wanted to throw in here was somebody asked a question about the impact of supply chain issues on inflation, which of course affects all of us. So yes, supply chain costs are impacting inflation because those companies are paying, one example is to import a container. When I was working as a buyer, cost I think $3,000, and now companies are paying upwards of $30,000. So just in the last 2 years, it's increased 4 to 5 times because of the imbalance in supply and capacity and demand, as we talked about. So that's just one example of where costs are going up, and those costs have to get passed somewhere, although we might not like to hear that. So hopefully those things will start to balance out and those costs will start to go back down for companies. But there is kind of a lag in that. So we might not see an immediate increase in prices as soon as companies are experiencing something. But if they experience it for long enough, they're going to start passing that on to their customers. And we already are seeing that in some areas. So are you going to be able to get everything for Christmas? Well, let's see. It's December 9th. I only have a small part of my shopping done, but I did go to stores a bit more than ordering everything online. So, but everything is, the shelves are not empty. Companies are able to get things to their customers. It might not be the exact SKU or variety of a product that you're looking for. If your child is asking for a very specific thing from Santa, you might need to guide them, a little bit to some other type if you can't find that exact Barbie doll or whatever it is. But there's product on the shelves and in the fulfillment centers and distribution centers, and it's going out as quickly as they can get it out. So the sooner you can do things, the better. You might have to pay a bit more to make it happen, especially if it's more last minute. Lisa, do you have any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's definitely, so it's interesting again that a lot of the bigger companies, they anticipated this. So Target, Walmart, Best Buy, those were just a few of the companies that went on record before at the beginning of the sort of holiday season to say, hey, our inventory is great. We have more inventory than ever. Come shop here. We're going to have what you want. And yes, there's plenty that you can buy. Every year, of course, there are things that go out of stock. I think what you'll see this year is that we probably can't get them replenished. That maybe in prior years, some things we could get a couple shipments in if it looked like they were going to be really hot. This year, what's ever hot, it's going to be after Christmas. Just a little example of what you might be experiencing. So I went online to order, and I have no idea what this is because I don't have kids this age. But my niece has little kids that are the age of 0 to 7, and she wanted this thing that automatically reads books that has these characters. So you could get the main unit, and then you have to buy all these characters. Yeah, one of those schemes. And they had the characters, like they said, yep, get this, get this. So I'd click on them and they'd say, order now. It will arrive by January 22nd. I'm like, wait a second. So they're kind of trying to disguise, I think, some of the out of stock and say, okay, we don't have it, but it's being made, or maybe it's on a boat, so we will be getting it. So if you really want that one, reserve it now and you can get it. And I don't remember seeing that as much in prior years of them trying to do these kind of things to retain that. So the interesting thing is, I think the problem has been overhyped, or maybe we've responded better. What we've seen, and this is always a problem too, if you're ordering online, is your stuff going to get there? How long is it going to take to get there? So a lot of you, and Monique just mentioned this, the trend is that because more people have been going to the stores and buying things, the delivery carriers are not as backed up. So there have been years where they have just said, forget it. If you don't order by X time, you're never going to get it. This year, they seem to be staying on top of things. Now, I do have to qualify. Last week, one day I was working at home. I looked out the window and there was a U-Haul truck, a big old U-Haul truck in front of my house. I'm like, what in the world is going on? And here's this guy gets out in his brown suit. It was the UPS driver. And next to him on his seat, you open the passenger door, there's boxes. It looked like total chaos. But he didn't look happy either. He must have gotten to work late and he couldn't get his brown truck. That was his punishment. You've got to take the U-Haul that isn't configured, to stack things nicely for delivery. So they're being creative that way too, and trying to do whatever they can. So I think, the supply chain resilience has been amazing, that companies have been able to respond, I think, as well as they have, given really what has been massive global chaos. But everything that I've been reading indicates that it should be a very good season, unfortunately, in some ways, for TJ Maxx after the holidays, because of all that stuff that's sitting in the port right now. That what is it? A lot of it was stuff that people did want for Christmas. So there might, when they actually get it, it's not going to probably be going into the first tier retailers, but it's going to be going to TJ Maxx, to the benefit of people like us who live in Oxford that have a TJ Maxx. So
great, awesome. I think you've answered everybody's questions so much. We only have one that came in, and Greg was just wondering, we didn't talk about the container ships stuck in the canal. Was that more of a news event, or did that have is there a big enough impact on like canal blockage that it's affecting all this?
That definitely impacted lots of things. There's just so many things that have happened that we couldn't even mention everything. Yeah, the container ship, I forget what it's called, the Ever Given, I think, was stuck in the Suez Canal last year. Yeah, for those of us teaching supply chain, there's just an endless stream of articles and things happening for us to talk about with our students. That impacted not only the ships that were currently there, but the entire flow of trade, because they couldn't get through the Suez Canal, and that backed up ships there, just like ships are currently backed up in the port. So that took, I don't know, maybe a few weeks at that point to sort out after it was dislodged from the Suez Canal. I saw a graphic that it was the same length as the height of the Empire State Building, to give people an idea of how big those ships are.
So I would just like to say one more thing about thinking about cost and inflation, because this is an area that I have spent a lot of my career and time studying. And so we talk about the huge run up in logistics costs and how much those have increased, containers going from $3,000 to $30,000. So, if you're buying a TV, that's not a big deal. If you're buying something that's more expensive, that's a tiny, tiny fraction of the total cost. So say that, it's a little bit if it's going up 10 times like this. So maybe it used to cost like $1 to ship a refrigerator across the ocean, which is unbelievable that that's all it would cost. Now, if you shipped it at the absolute worst time, that would have been $10. Okay, that's not going to make the cost of your refrigerator go up dramatically. But you think about all the little stuff that you buy at the dollar store, the stuff that is, hanging by the checkout if you actually go into the store, if you're in, Kroger or Walmart or Target, all that stuff that they're trying to get you to buy, has a huge impact on that stuff because, for them, the value of the item is, 10 cents or something, and it used to cost them a penny or 5 cents to ship. Well, now the value of the item is still only 20 cents, but now all of a sudden their cost to ship is huge. It's as much as that item. So the dollar stores, they're stressing out. They're saying we have to be the $1.50 store now or the $1.25 store. So I think that's where you're going to see the impact for sure, percentage wise, much, much faster. So we have to if you're buying more expensive things, you got to keep them honest. And if they're having like a huge price run up and they're saying that's because of logistics, they are not telling you the truth. That is not what it's from. And also, I don't know about you guys, but every time I go somewhere, and this probably catches me more than it catches a lot of you because you're not like dealing with supply chain all the time. Every time something is not working right anywhere, it's a supply chain glitch. I'm like, I'm not so sure about that. So we'll see.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll remain skeptical of blaming everything on the supply chain.
Yeah. Be careful.
Oh yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, thank you both so much for sharing your expertise. We appreciate the audience involvement and of course you two for your time. We really appreciate it. If you want to stay connected to the Center for Supply Chain Excellence, their website is linked in Monique's bio below the event listing, as well as there's a button if you're interested in supporting their important work financially. We would greatly appreciate that. Also want to make sure you know that we still have other upcoming events in December, including another holiday wine tasting with Jack Keegan next Thursday. If you're able to join us for that, and all of our events are probably where you're watching this, alumlc.org/MiamiOH. Thank you all once again for watching today's event, and thank you again, Lisa and Monique. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you,
JJ. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Yep. Have a great day, everyone. Love and honor.
Bye-bye.
Bye.